And as you're driving home to get to the house, you're thinking, you know, this has got to be a nightmare. This has just got to be a bad dream. I don't know how much more of this I can take. And as you get to your house, to your home, you're saying, you know what, I'm just going to kind of chill out. I'm going to relax a few minutes, and I'm going to get myself together and then and figure all this out. That's a lot in one day to happen. And all of a sudden you unlock the door, and as you begin to walk in, your feet are soaked. Your floor is covered with water. Thank goodness a plumber lives next door. You call him, he comes by and says, oh my goodness, this is going to be a job. We're going to have to take up a wall. We're going to have to dig up the floor. We've got some major problems here. And I just want to tell you that I'm going to give you the best deal I can, but it's not going to be cheap. In fact, to be honest with you, it's going to be quite expensive. Okay, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, that taught in Sunday school how God would take care of everything, and He always takes care of His children. Okay, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, that a faithful member of the church with great moral standards and values, you pray every day, you study every day. What do you do now? Better yet, it's such a good, godly Christian like you are. Why in the world would God allow this to happen? Now I know that this scenario is exaggerated to some degree. But you and I both know that sometimes when it rains, it pours. And this is the title of our message this morning. When it rains, it pours. And this is the last message of our series, Entry, Midterm, and Final Exams. And over the past 3 weeks, going on our 4th week now, I've been trying to teach on what how God will test us from time to time. We're no different from the saints in the Bible, whether it's Abraham, Ruth, and many others, Paul, and all like this in the Bible, that have went through trials and tribulations, and sometimes it has nothing to do with sin in your life. I know that's the first thought in our minds is, what have I done wrong to deserve this? But you know, sometimes, just like Job, there's nothing he did wrong. Sometimes we're just going to go through tests. Sometimes we're going to go through trials. Sometimes they're not going to be major tests. Sometimes they're going to be minor, but they're still aggravating. Other times we're going to wonder, how in the world am I going to get out of this mess? We've all been there. God will place tests and trials on His people. Amen. Now, I think Rick Warren summed it up best in his book, Purpose-Driven Life, where he said, this earth is a battleground. This earth is a battleground. For a believer, it is a battleground. It doesn't mean you're going to be exempt from problems or trials or tribulations or entry, midterm, or final exams. And sometimes it just seems like when it rains, it pours. The question is, what do you do? How do you handle it when it rains and pours? I'm not just talking about something where you misplace your car keys. I'm talking about when just things just constantly just come on you, one right after another. What do you do? Well, I'm going to share some things with you this morning. 3 things that King Jehoshaphat did. He was king of Judah. And I'm going to explain to you what he did and what we can do when it rains and pours. Number 1, don't blame God, pray to God. Number 1, don't blame God, pray to God. Now, in order to get the gist of this message, we need to grasp a little background information about what has taken place. King Jehoshaphat is a godly man. He loves the Lord, he worships the Lord, he is a godly king, and he's king of Judah. Judah was the southern part of Israel. Israel was divided up into 2 parts. The northern part was Israel. The bottom part was called Judah. And he was king of Judah. Now, when I said he was a good, godly king, the unique part about King Jehoshaphat that was very seldom. When they started having kings, it was very seldom that they had a good, godly king. Most of the time, it was an ungodly king who allowed paganism and pagan worship to happen in Judah and Israel. But in this particular time period, King Jehoshaphat was a godly man. He was a good man. He was a God-fearing man. But if you notice something in verse 1, it says that there's news that there's fixing to be a war. There's fixing to be an ambush attack. The Moabites are going to be on one side. The Amorites are going to be on the other. But I want you to notice two words there in verse 1 where it says, others beside. And what this means is not only the Amorites, which was a thorn in Israel's flesh, but also the Moabites, but also it said that there was other besides. In other words, there was a conglomerate bunch of nations or a merger here that said, let's go after Judah. It wasn't just one nation. It wasn't just two nations. It was several of them together saying, let's go and attack them, make them be our slaves, and steal everything they have. Now, the other thing to notice when we talk about a little background information is in verse 3 and verse 12. King Jehoshaphat admits he's scared. In fact, in verse 3 it says, and he feared. He was scared about what was going to take place. He was frightened. And in verse 12, he just says it flat out, I don't know what to do. And you know, sometimes when it rains and it pours, we don't have a clue what to do sometimes. But you know what we got to be very careful about? Is blaming God. Because blaming God just seems to be the thing to do. In other words, God, why me? God, I've went to church and I've studied, and God, I'm trying to live for you. And Lord, you got all these heathens out there, you got all these ungodly people. God, why so much? God, I understand trials and I understand tests and I understand little exams, but God, it's just one thing after another. And Lord, when it rains, it pours. Lord, why? Why are you doing this? And if you're not careful, it's very easy to blame God. You can just, a couple scenarios or a couple examples here is if you go back to the Garden of Eden, you will find when Adam and Eve took of the forbidden tree that God told them specifically not to, or God told Adam not to, you'll find that when God questioned Adam, Adam blamed God. He said, Lord, it was the woman that did it. And Lord, not only that, Lord, you gave her to me. Lord, it's your fault, is what Adam was saying. Lord, quit putting all this on me. Okay, God, if you wouldn't have done this, Lord, I wouldn't have had to worry about it. God, it's you. Take responsibility, God. That's basically what Adam was saying. If you go to the book of Job, and everything that happened to him that we talked about last week, that happened in a 24-hour period, all the things that was taken away from him, from the richest man in the world to living in poverty, sitting in ashes, mourning and hurting. And when his wife, who was so upset and out of her mind, said, why don't you just curse God and die? He refused to. She said, why don't you just get it over with, Job? They're so easy to blame God for our situations. And a lot of times, we think, well, maybe it's something we deserve. Maybe it's because of sin in our life. Let me say this. It could be. But if you're clean, if you got no unconfessed sin in your life, and you have confessed everything, and you're right with God, and you're living for the will of God, it doesn't mean that you're going to be exempt from troubles. Now, one thing that I believe with all sincerity is that we take for granted is our prayer life. Sometimes it is so easy to take our prayer life for granted. In a situation that comes up and sometimes you just hold up your hands and you say, oh brother, what next? Does it get any worse than this? My gosh, what can happen next? And we make things worse than what they really are. Granted, they're bad. Granted, it's tough. Granted, we don't want to go through these things. And granted, we don't know what to do, but sometimes we just worry and we fret and we get so discouraged over things that we forget to pray. Because we're so busy murmuring and upset and just worrying. Well, here, and you talk about a pressure situation, King Jehoshaphat has a nation on his shoulders. He's the king. Everybody's looking for him. King, what do we do? What do we do, king? You're the king. And the king is actually scared to death. I mean, who wouldn't be? He has the responsibility of the whole nation here. And he begins in verse number 3, and he says, I tell you what we're going to do is we're going to seek God. Step 1, we're going to seek God. We're going to proclaim a fast, and we're going to seek God. Do I know what to do? No. Am I clueless? Yes. And is all this stuff overbearing and coming down when it rains and pours? Yes. What are you going to do? I'm going to seek God. You see, if you notice, in verse number 3, it says that Jehoshaphat feared and set himself to seek the Lord. He set himself. What does that mean? It means he got his composure. He said, okay, all right, we're fixing to be attacked. We got it's not just the Amorites, ain't Moabites, it's a bunch of them. And I don't know what to do. Yeah, and I'm scared. Let me get my composure here. He said, I know what we got to do. Listen, everybody, let's seek God. Let's seek the Lord. Let's proclaim a fast, and let's leave it in the Lord's hands. You see, what he did was, he didn't blame God. He prayed to God. And sometimes in our circumstances, in our darkest moments, we spend so much time worrying and getting discouraged that we don't pray like we should. So number 1, when it rains and it pours, what do? Don't blame God. Pray to God.